People kept waiting for me to cry at the funeral. I didn't. Not because I didn't love Richard. God, I loved that man for 41 years. But standing at that graveside in Greenwich, watching the November sky press down gray and heavy over the cemetery, I already knew what was coming. I could feel it the way you feel a storm before the clouds arrive, that particular stillness in the air that means nothing good. I had something in my coat pocket, something Richard left me. I hadn't fully read it yet. I wasn't ready, but I would be. 6 months earlier, my life looked the way it had always looked. Quiet, ordinary, the kind of life people describe as comfortable when they're trying to be kind, and boring when they're not. Richard and I lived in the same house in Greenwich, Connecticut for 30 years, a white colonial on Fieldstone Lane, with a garden I'd been failing to keep tidy since 1998. I was retired by then. 32 years teaching art at Greenwich High, and when I finally stopped, I honestly didn't know what to do with myself for about 3 weeks. Then I found the literacy program in Bridgeport. Every Thursday morning, I drove 20 minutes up I-95 and sat across from adults learning to read for the first time. And I thought, this is enough. This is a good life. Richard worked. He always worked. Civil engineer turned commercial real estate developer, quiet about money the way men of his generation could be. He handled everything. I never asked, and that arrangement suited us both for 4 decades. I knew we were comfortable. I didn't know what comfortable actually meant until after he was gone. His son, our son, Derek, was 40 years old and had worked in Richard's company for 12 years without ever quite stepping out of his father's shadow. That wasn't Richard's fault. Derek was talented enough, but he'd married Scarlett 3 years into the job, and somewhere in those 8 years since, Scarlett had become the one with the ambitions. She was beautiful in the way of someone who has worked very hard at it. Polished. Strategic. She called me Mom, with a warmth that felt like a performance reviewed and refined over years. I tried to like her. Truly. I'm not the kind of woman who assumes the worst of people. But some people show you who they are slowly, in small moments, if you pay attention. I paid attention. Richard had a health scare 2 years before he died. He didn't tell me about it. Not fully. I found his cardiologist's card in his jacket pocket when I was taking his suits to the cleaner, and when I asked, he said it was nothing. Routine. He was fine. He smiled the way he did when he wanted a subject closed. I let it close. I wish I'd pushed. After that, though, I noticed he spent more evenings at his desk. More phone calls with Harrison, his attorney, a quiet, sharp man from Westport whom I'd met at maybe 6 dinners in 35 years. I didn't ask about those either. We had our arrangements, our silences. I thought they were signs of a long, trusting marriage. Maybe they were. Maybe he was protecting me from decisions he'd already made. I still don't know exactly how to feel about that. He died on a Tuesday in October. Cardiac event, they said. At his office on Lexington Avenue, the building with his name on the lease, though I didn't know then what else had his name on it, or mine. His assistant called me. Not Derek. Derek, I thought when I heard her voice. Where is Derek? By the time I got to Lenox Hill Hospital, Derek and Scarlett were already there. Scarlett was at the admissions desk with a folder of documents I didn't know she had. She handed things to nurses with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this. I sat in a plastic chair in the corridor and held Richard's hand for 20 minutes after they told us. His hand was already cold. I memorized the weight of it. Derek made calls in the hallway. I heard fragments. Estate attorney, probate timeline, board notification. He called the board before he called me, I realized. Or maybe she did. I want to pause for just a moment. If you're watching from wherever you are in the world, and this story is already pulling at something in you, I hope you'll subscribe. I share stories like this one every week, about ordinary women who find extraordinary strength. Now, back to that night. The reception was at our house. My house. The one Richard and I had filled with 30 years of ordinary Sundays and small arguments, and 1,000 dinners. After the last guest left, I was in the kitchen washing a serving dish that didn't need washing, just needing something to do with my hands, when I heard Scarlett in the living room. I heard the pop of a wine bottle, Richard's Bordeaux, the good shelf. I set down the dish. When I walked in, she was sitting in Richard's chair. His chair, the leather one by the window that held the shape of him, and she was sitting in it with her heels off and her feet tucked under her, like she owned the whole room. Derek stood beside her. He didn't look at me when I came in. Scarlett did. She looked at me with an expression I can only describe as settled. Like something had been decided. "We've been talking," she said. "And we think, for everyone's sake, it's time to start transitioning the house. Derek will need to manage the estate properly. So Mom," she tilted her head, just slightly, "you should probably start thinking about packing your things. There's a lovely retirement community in Westport. We can look into it." I looked at my son. He was looking at the floor. 40 years. I raised that boy, took him to Little League and held him when his first dog died, and drove him to the ER at 2 a.m. when he broke his collarbone falling out of a tree, and he was standing there, in his father's living room, on the night of his father's funeral, looking at the floor. I looked back at Scarlett. I said, "Okay." She blinked. Just once. She'd been ready for tears, ready for a fight. She got 2 letters and a closed expression, and I watched her decide in real time that I had nothing left in me. She raised her glass toward Derek, just slightly, just enough, and said quietly, like I wasn't standing 6 feet away, "I told you she wouldn't be a problem." I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed Richard and I had shared for 3 decades, in the room that still smelled faintly of his aftershave, and I reached into the pocket of my coat. I took out the envelope. Harrison had pressed it into my hand at the cemetery, quietly, between condolences, while Scarlett was air-kissing one of Richard's colleagues. He'd said only, "Read it when you're alone. All of it. Don't make any decisions until you do." I turned it over in my hands. My name on the front, in Richard's handwriting. Vivian. I hadn't opened it yet because some part of me understood that whatever was inside would change everything. That once I read it, I couldn't unknow it. And I needed one last night of not knowing. But downstairs, I could hear Scarlett laughing at something. Relaxed. Victorious. I slid my finger under the seal, and then I stopped. Because there wasn't one document inside. There were 3. And the third one, the one at the bottom, on paper with a different letterhead than the others, had a name on it I didn't recognize. A name that had no business being anywhere near my husband's private papers. Who was she? I sat on that bed for a long time. The house was quiet now. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway, ticking the way it always had. Steady, indifferent. The same sound it made the night Derek was born, and the night Richard proposed, and every ordinary Tuesday in between. Clocks don't care what's happening around them. I've always found that either comforting or cruel, depending on the moment. That night, it felt cruel. I spread the 3 documents across the duvet. The first was a letter from Richard. Handwritten, 2 pages, his familiar slanted print. I set it aside. I wasn't ready for his voice yet. The second was a legal document. Dense, formal. I recognized Harrison's firm's letterhead at the top. I read the first paragraph twice before the words settled into meaning. Revocable Living Trust. Voss Commercial Properties. Sole Trustee. Vivian Ann Voss. I read it again. Sole Trustee. I set it down carefully, the way you set down something fragile, and I looked at the wall for a moment. The watercolor I'd painted 20 years ago, a loose, imperfect rendering of our backyard in early spring, hung slightly crooked, the way it always had, and Richard always pretended not to notice, because straightening it was my job, and we both knew it. He put the company in my name, I thought. The whole thing. Without telling me. My hands weren't shaking. I noticed that. I thought they should be. I picked up the third document. The name at the top wasn't mine. It wasn't Richard's. It wasn't Harrison's firm. It was a woman named Joanna Fitch. And below her name, in clean legal formatting, was an address in White Plains, New York, and a notation that read, "Secondary beneficiary, conditional distribution upon primary trustee election." I didn't know that name. I had never heard Richard say it. In 41 years of marriage, not once. Secondary beneficiary. I turned the page over as if there might be an explanation on the back. There wasn't. I put everything back in the envelope. I turned off the light. I lay down on top of the duvet in my funeral dress, and I stared at the ceiling, until sometime around 3 in the morning when I finally slept. I left the next morning before Scarlett came downstairs. I didn't make a scene. I didn't take much. A suitcase, my art supplies, the photograph from our 20th anniversary that lived on the nightstand, and the quilt my grandmother made that had no business being left in a house that no longer felt like mine. I carried everything to my car in 2 trips. The housekeeper, Gloria, who'd worked for us for 11 years, was in the kitchen when I passed through. She looked at my suitcase. She looked at my face. She said, "Mrs. Voss." Just that. I said, "Take care of the tomatoes until spring, would you? They'll need covering if it freezes." She pressed her lips together and nodded, and I could see she understood more than I'd said. I got in the car, and I drove to Stamford, and I checked into a furnished apartment I'd found on my phone in the parking lot of the funeral home the previous afternoon. Room 4B, 1 bedroom, a small kitchen with fluorescent lighting that buzzed faintly, a window that looked out over a parking structure. I sat on the edge of the bed, a different bed, a stranger's bed, and for the first time since Richard died, I cried. Not for the company, not for the house, not even for what Scarlett had done, for Derek. For the boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder watching baseball. For whatever version of my son had been slowly replaced by the man who stood in his father's living room and looked at the floor. I cried for about 40 minutes. Then I washed my face, made terrible instant coffee from a packet in the welcome basket, and called Ruth. Ruth Calloway had been my closest friend since 1987, when we were both volunteering at the same school book fair and discovered we had identical opinions about the same terrible parent. She was a retired family law paralegal, sharp as anyone I'd ever met, and the kind of woman who listened completely before she said a single word. I told her everything, the envelope, the trust, the name I didn't recognize. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Vivian," she said, "don't talk to anyone else until you've talked to Harrison." "I know. Not Derek, not anyone at the company, no one. I know, Ruth. And that name, Joanna Fitch. Don't search for her yet. Don't do anything that leaves a trail." I hadn't even thought of that. "You think I need to worry about a trail?" She paused, just a beat too long. "I think Richard was careful about how he set this up. I think you should be careful too." After we hung up, I sat with that thought. Richard was careful. He had been, hadn't he? 2 years of quiet restructuring, a private attorney nobody knew about, documents tucked into an envelope handed to me between handshakes at a cemetery. None of it accidental, none of it rushed. He knew something I didn't, I realized. He'd known it for a while. I met with Harrison Wells 3 days later at his office in Westport, a small, wood-paneled suite above an insurance agency on Post Road that looked exactly like you'd expect a 71-year-old private attorney's office to look. He had a photograph of his golden retriever on the desk and a coffee maker that had seen better decades. He poured me a cup without asking and sat down across from me and folded his hands. "You read everything," he said. It wasn't a question. "I read the trust documents," I said. "I read most of Richard's letter. I haven't finished it." I paused. "I need you to tell me about Joanna Fitch before I can." Harrison looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite read. Careful. Measuring. "What did Richard's letter say about her?" "I told you. I haven't finished it." He nodded slowly. "Then finish it tonight, Vivian. Read every word, and then call me in the morning." He paused. "What I can tell you right now is that she's not a threat to you. She's a complication. But she may also be the most important person in this entire situation, and you're going to need to decide very quickly how you want to handle her." I set down my coffee cup. "Harrison, is she someone Richard?" "Finish the letter," he said quietly. "Please. Before I tell you what was in that letter, maybe you already know how it feels to discover that the person you trusted most was carrying a secret you never suspected. I don't know what you would have done in my place. I'm not sure I know what I would have done either, if I'd had any choice in the matter." I read Richard's letter that night, all of it. By the time I reached the last paragraph, my coffee had gone cold, and the fluorescent light above me was buzzing, and I sat very still in that small Stamford kitchen for a very long time. Joanna Fitch was not what I'd feared. She was something I hadn't imagined. Joanna Fitch was 44 years old. She lived in White Plains. She was a bookkeeper who had worked briefly for Voss Commercial Properties 11 years ago, before Derek joined the company, before Scarlett. And she was the person who had come to Richard, quietly, 3 years ago, with documents she'd found while helping organize old company records. Documents that showed Derek's wife, before she was Derek's wife, before she'd ever met our family, had been involved in a financial scheme with a previous employer, small enough to avoid prosecution, large enough to ruin a reputation, a pattern of behavior that Richard's own attorneys, when quietly shown the evidence, described in a memo I now held in my hands as consistent with long-term predatory financial conduct. Scarlett hadn't married Derek for love. She'd married him for what she believed he would one day inherit. And Richard had known it for 3 years. He hadn't told Derek because he knew Derek wouldn't believe him. He hadn't confronted Scarlett because he knew she'd simply adapt. Instead, he'd done the only thing he could think of that she couldn't argue with, contest, or charm her way around. He'd removed what she was after, he'd put it all in my name, and he'd left Joanna Fitch, the woman who'd handed him the documents, the woman Scarlett had never met and didn't know existed, as a protected witness whose statement was already on file with Harrison's office, sealed, notarized, and waiting, in case anything happens to me, Richard had written, and in case Scarlett tries to fight what I've done. Joanna's testimony establishes the reason for every decision I made. It establishes that I was not confused, not pressured, not acting out of spite. I was protecting what I built, and I was protecting you, and I was protecting our son from a woman who chose him the way a person chooses a lock to pick. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I thought I had more time. I thought I always had more time. I folded the letter. I held it against my chest. Outside the window, the parking structure lights hummed orange against the November dark. Then I opened my phone and called Harrison. He picked up on the second ring. I finished it, I said. And? I looked at Richard's handwriting on the folded page in my hand. I thought about Scarlett in his chair, raising his wine glass, telling my son I wouldn't be a problem. Get me a meeting with the best trust litigation attorney in Manhattan, I said. And Harrison, I want to meet Joanna Fitch. A pause. Then, I'll make the calls in the morning. No, I said. Tonight. Naomi Reyes called me at 7:15 the next morning. Harrison had reached her the previous night. Apparently they had a professional relationship going back 15 years. The kind built on mutual respect and the occasional referral when a case crossed the line from personal law into litigation territory. She had a corner office on the 38th floor of a building on Park Avenue, and a voice that sounded like she'd never lost a night's sleep worrying about anything she couldn't control. I liked her immediately. Mrs. Voss, she said, without preamble. Harrison sent me the trust documents last night. I've reviewed them. I have 2 questions before we meet. Go ahead. Do you have the original deed to the Lexington Avenue property in your possession? Harrison has it. Good. Second question. Does your daughter-in-law know about Joanna Fitch? I thought about it. I don't see how she could. Perfect, Naomi said. Keep it that way. Don't discuss her name on the phone. Don't write it in any email. Don't mention her to anyone who might mention her to anyone else. As far as Scarlett is concerned, Joanna Fitch doesn't exist. A brief pause. Can you be in my office Thursday at 10? It was Tuesday. I'll be there, I said. I hung up and stood at my small kitchen window, watching the morning come up gray and cold over the parking structure. Somewhere across town, in my house, Scarlett was probably making coffee in my kitchen, with the good beans Richard ordered from a place in Vermont. Probably sitting at my table. Probably already making calls. Let her, I thought. Let her believe she's already won. I met Joanna Fitch on a Wednesday evening at a diner in Yonkers. Ruth's suggestion, neutral ground, nothing that could connect us to Hartford or Greenwich or anyone named Voss. I got there first and took a corner booth. I ordered tea and watched the door. She came in at 6:02. Mid-40s, dark coat, careful eyes that swept the room before she found me. She looked like someone who had learned to assess situations quickly, like someone who had spent time around people who didn't have her best interests in mind. She slid into the booth across from me and said, "You look like him." "Like Richard?" "Around the eyes," she said. "The way you were watching the door." I didn't know what to do with that, so I let it sit. She wrapped both hands around the coffee mug the waitress brought and looked at me steadily. "I want you to know I didn't come to him with those documents looking for anything. I wasn't trying to. I wasn't after a reward or protection or any kind of arrangement. I found something that felt wrong, and I told the person who deserved to know. That's all." "I believe you," I said. And I did. "He was good to me," she said quietly. "He made sure I was protected. Set up the statement with Harrison. Made sure I had legal cover, if it ever came to that. He said," she stopped. pressed her lips together. He said he hoped it never would. That he hoped she'd just be a decent person. I almost smiled. That was Richard. Hoping for the best while quietly preparing for the worst. Will you testify? I asked. If it comes to that. She looked at me for a long moment. Mrs. Voss? She said. I've been ready for 3 years. Thursday, Park Avenue, 38th floor. Naomi's office looked exactly like you'd expect. Ordered, expensive, no wasted space. She had the trust documents and the deed laid out on the conference table when I arrived, already annotated in 3 colors of ink. She walked me through everything with the calm efficiency of someone explaining a weather system. Here's what you own, here's why it's airtight, here's where they'll try to find a crack, and here's why they won't. The trust was executed 26 months ago, she said. Richard was in full health at that point. His cardiologist will confirm it. The formation is clean, the asset transfer to the trust is properly recorded, the deed to Lexington Avenue is filed with the county, taxes have been paid in your name for 2 years. There is no legal argument that undoes this. Scarlett's already looking for one, I said. I know. Naomi folded her hands. She's been calling around. Discreetly, but not discreetly enough. She spoke to 2 attorneys last week. Both told her the same thing I'm telling you. There's nothing to contest. She hasn't accepted that yet. She won't? I said. Not until she has no choice. Naomi looked at me with an expression that was almost approval. No, she won't. She paused. So, the question isn't whether you'll win, Mrs. Voss. The question is how you want to win. Quietly, through the legal process, with minimal confrontation. Or, I want her to understand what she did, I said. Not just lose. I want her to understand, specifically, clearly, what happened and why. And I want Derek to see it. Naomi was quiet for a moment. That, she said carefully, requires a different kind of patience. I have nothing but time, I said. She picked up her pen. Then let's talk about sequence. I went back to my Stamford apartment, and I did something that surprised even me. I painted. 3 days, mostly in the mornings, while the plan settled into its own shape in the back of my mind. Landscapes, mostly, the kind I hadn't done in years, loose and imprecise, color for its own sake. The fluorescent light was terrible for it, but I didn't care. I needed my hands doing something familiar, while the rest of me adjusted to living in unfamiliar territory. On Thursdays, I still drove to Bridgeport. I still sat across from adults learning to read for the first time, and I helped them sound out words they'd been embarrassed not to know for decades, and I thought, this is still my life. She didn't take my life. She took a house. Ruth called every other day. I told her what I could. How are you holding up? She asked one evening. Better than I should be, I said honestly. That's either very healthy or very worrying, probably both. Meanwhile, and this was the part I had to discipline myself not to rush, I watched. Scarlett moved fast. She always had. I could track the outline of her movements through the company's CFO, a careful, precise man named Walter Briggs, who had worked for Richard for 19 years, and who called me 3 weeks after the funeral, with a voice that was professionally neutral and personally furious. Mrs. Voss, he said, I think you should know that Mrs. Scarlett Voss has requested an emergency board meeting for the 14th. She's circulated a proposal to consolidate executive authority in Derek's office, effective immediately. She's also, and I want to be delicate here, suggested that my position be restructured. Restructured. The word sat there like a bruise. Walter, I said, who does the board report to right now? A pause. Technically the trust. Which means me, I said. Another pause. Longer. Yes, Mrs. Voss. It does. Cancel the board meeting, I said. Politely. Cite scheduling conflicts. And Walter, say nothing else to anyone until you hear from Naomi Reyes. She'll be in touch. Understood, he said. And then, quietly, Richard spoke about you often, Mrs. Voss. He said you were the steadiest person he'd ever known. I thanked him and hung up before my voice could do something embarrassing. The first move came in late November. The Lexington Avenue building had a tenant situation that needed handling, an anchor lease on floors 12 through 18, up for renegotiation, the kind of deal that would significantly affect the building's long-term value depending on how it was handled. The tenant's representative had reached out to the company's general line. Scarlett, through Derek, had already made an informal proposal. Short-term lease, below market rate. The kind of deal that looked like generosity, but was actually designed to preserve flexibility. Specifically, the flexibility to restructure terms once she believed she controlled the asset. What she didn't know was that the tenant's representative had also, separately, received a letter from Naomi's office identifying me as the building's legal owner and inviting them to schedule a direct meeting. They chose the direct meeting. I walked into that conference room on the 31st floor of my building. I was still adjusting to that. In a gray wool blazer I'd bought at a department store in Stamford because my good clothes were still in Greenwich. Walter sat beside me. Naomi's associate sat at the end of the table. I looked like someone's grandmother. I negotiated a 12-year lease at 34% above the previous rate. The tenant's representative shook my hand at the end and said, "Mrs. Voss, your husband built something exceptional here." "He did," I said. "I intend to keep it that way." The call came to Derek's office 2 days later. The tenant confirming the signed lease, directly with Mrs. Voss. The company attorney calling the CFO. Walter saying, carefully, deliberately, "You should speak with Harrison Wells." I wasn't there, but I heard about it from Walter that evening. "Derek called 3 times, Walter said. The third time he wasn't entirely calm. And Scarlett? She came to the office. A pause. She asked to see Richard's original company formation documents. I told her they were with the trust's legal representative. How did she take that?" "She smiled," Walter said. "The kind of smile that means someone is deciding something." I knew that smile. "Walter, document everything she asks for from this point forward. Every request, every email, everything." "Already started," he said. Naomi filed the trust documentation with the company's registered agent on a Monday morning in December. No announcement, no press release, no warning call to Derek. Just a formal, correct, properly time-stamped legal filing that notified the board that controlling interest in Voss Commercial Properties resided in the Vivian Ann Voss Revocable Living Trust, and that the trustee was exercising her authority, effective immediately. I was in Bridgeport when it landed. I found out later, through Walter, that a board member's assistant mentioned it to Derek, assuming he already knew. Derek called Scarlett, and that was the moment, I think. The moment she finally understood that something had happened underneath her that she hadn't felt coming. Like a floor that had been quietly, methodically removed while she danced on it. I wasn't there to see her face. Walter told me she stood in the bathroom of the Greenwich house for almost 20 minutes before she came back out. The bathroom with the marble tile that Richard and I had picked together in 1997. She came to Lexington Avenue on a Thursday. My Thursday. I was in Bridgeport. She walked into the lobby of my building and told the front desk she was representing the Voss family and needed immediate access to the management office. She implied authority she didn't have. She used a tone, apparently, that assumed compliance. The building manager called my cell at 11:14. I was sitting across from a 58-year-old man named Gerald, who was learning to read Charlotte's Web because his granddaughter loved it, and he wanted to read it to her himself. We were on the chapter where Charlotte first speaks. I stepped into the hallway. "Have her escorted out," I said quietly. "Note the incident in writing, timestamp it, and send everything to Naomi Reyes tonight." I went back inside. Gerald had been waiting patiently, the book open on the table between us. "Sorry about that," I said. "Everything okay?" he asked. I looked at the open page. Charlotte's words in their web. Some pig. "Yes," I said. "Everything's fine." The cease and desist arrived at the Greenwich house on a Wednesday morning. Process server. 9 a.m. Served at the door. I know because Walter told me. Scarlett called Derek twice in the following hour, and Derek called the company attorney, and the company attorney, very carefully, said there was nothing he could do. She fired her first attorney that afternoon. Hired a second one by Friday. The second attorney reviewed Naomi's filings. The trust formation, the cardiologist's affidavit confirming Richard's full mental capacity, the witness statements, the deed records, 2 years of property tax payments in my name, and called Scarlett within a week. I don't know exactly what he said, but I know she fired him too. The third attorney lasted 9 days. It was Ruth, who called me on a Sunday evening in January, 3 months after the funeral, when the legal fees Scarlett was accumulating had reached a number that Walter described as significant. Derek came to see me, Ruth said. I sat up straighter. When? This afternoon. He came alone. She paused. Vivian, he looked terrible. He asked me if I knew what was happening. What did you tell him? I told him to call his mother. I held the phone and looked at the watercolor on my wall, the crooked one, the backyard in spring, and I thought about my son's face at the funeral, at the floor, at his shoes, not looking at me. Did he? I asked. Not yet, Ruth said. But Vivian, I think he's starting to see it. See what? A long pause. Her, Ruth said simply. I was quiet for a moment. Good, I said. I called Naomi on Monday morning. It's time, I said. She didn't ask what I meant. The restaurant? Yes. I'll draft the summary document, she said. 1 page. Clean. Everything she needs to see in one place. And Joanna? On standby. Affidavit sealed and ready. If Scarlett's fourth attorney tries anything, we file everything simultaneously. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Naomi, I said, I want to meet them myself first, before any of it goes public. Just us. At the table. A pause. Are you sure you don't have to? I want to look at her, I said quietly. I want her to have to look at me. Another pause. Longer. Okay, Naomi said. Then we do it your way. I booked the table at the Italian restaurant on Greenwich Avenue for Thursday evening, the one Richard and I went to on anniversaries, the one with the good bread and the corner table by the window, and the owner, who always remembered that Richard liked extra lemon with his fish. I called and made the reservation under my own name, Voss, party of 3, and then I sat down at my small kitchen table in my small Stamford apartment, and for the first time since November, I felt something that wasn't grief or strategy or careful controlled patience. I felt ready. I arrived at the restaurant at 6:15. They weren't coming until 7. I wanted the extra time. I wanted to sit in that corner booth by the window and let the place settle around me, the way familiar places do when you haven't been inside them in a while. The owner, a round-faced man named Frank who'd been running that kitchen for 23 years, came out when he saw me and took both my hands in his and said he was sorry about Richard. His eyes meant it. I thanked him, and he brought me sparkling water and warm bread, without being asked, and left me alone, which was exactly right. I sat there and watched Greenwich Avenue through the window. December had turned to January, had turned to February, and now it was the kind of late winter evening where the cold had a particular quality, sharp and clear, the sky already dark by 6, the streetlights making small gold circles on the wet pavement outside. I thought about the last time Richard and I sat at this table, our 39th anniversary. He'd ordered the branzino and complained mildly about the portion size, and then eaten all of it. We'd talked about nothing important. A book I was reading, a project he was considering, whether we should repaint the front door in spring. The conversation of people who have been together so long that the small things are the important things. I would give anything, I thought, for one more dinner of nothing important. I let myself feel that, for exactly as long as it took to finish the bread. Then I put it away. They arrived at 2 minutes past 7. I saw them through the window before they came in. Scarlett in a dark coat, Derek beside her, his shoulders carrying that particular tension I'd watched him develop over 8 years of marriage to a woman who treated every room like a negotiation. She was speaking to him as they walked. He was nodding without looking at her. She briefed him in the car, I thought. She told him how this would go. Frank seated them across from me. Scarlett's eyes moved over the table immediately, taking inventory the way she always did, assessing, calculating. She registered the single page of paper face down near my water glass, and I watched her decide not to look at it. Derek looked at me, and something moved across his face that I hadn't seen in a long time. Something young. Mom, he said. Sit down, sweetheart, I said. Scarlett sat first. I let the silence breathe for a moment. Frank poured water. No one looked at the menus. Then I said, I want to say something before we get into any of it, and I need you both to just let me finish. Scarlett's chin lifted slightly. Prepared. Armored. I know you thought you knew who I was, I said. I think a lot of people made that mistake over the years. Honestly, I made it myself sometimes. I spent 41 years being the person who held things steady so everyone else could move. I was good at it. I didn't mind it. But I think somewhere along the way, steady got confused with simple. Patient got confused with unaware. I looked at Derek. He wasn't looking at the floor this time. Your father knew the difference, I said. He always knew. I turned the document over and slid it across the table. Scarlett looked at it. I watched her read the first 3 lines. The trust, the building, the board authority, and I watched the armor do something I hadn't expected. It didn't crack. It went very, very still. The way water goes still right before it freezes. She already suspected, I realized. She just didn't know how much. Derek read over her shoulder. I watched the color change in his face as the numbers and words arranged themselves into meaning. The $28 million. The Lexington Avenue deed. 2 years of taxes in my name. He stopped, started again. Dad did this? 2 years ago, I said. After a health scare he didn't tell us about. He didn't tell me. He didn't tell either of us, I said. That's the thing about your father. He was very good at carrying things quietly. Scarlett set the document down. When she looked up, her expression had reorganized itself into something I recognized. The next strategy, already forming. This doesn't change the fact that Derek is a rightful Scarlett. Just her name. Quietly. She stopped. Your position at this company is real and it's yours for as long as you want it, I said to Derek. The VP role, the salary, the minority stake, none of that changes. That's not what this is about. I looked at Scarlett then, directly, the way I'd been wanting to for 3 months. What changes is this, I said. You have no standing here, no authority, no claim. Every attorney you've hired has told you the same thing, and the 4th one will tell you the same thing too. I paused. And what you did, the night of Richard's funeral, in his house, in his chair, with his wine, I want you to know, I remember every word. I remember the way you said it. I remember what you didn't bother to keep your voice down about. The restaurant was quiet around us. Soft music. The sound of other tables' conversations. Frank's kitchen producing something that smelled like garlic and white wine. Scarlett opened her mouth. I said okay, I said, before she could. That night, I said okay, and I meant it. I have been okay. I am going to continue to be okay. In my building, with my trust, with my board, with my name on a deed that's been filed in this county for 2 years. I folded my hands on the table. If you'd like to spend the next 2 years and whatever is left of your legal budget fighting something you cannot win, Naomi Reyes will be there. She enjoys it, I think. I let that sit. Or, I said, you can let this be over. The silence that followed was the longest of my life. Not because I was afraid of what Scarlett would say, because I was watching my son. Derek was looking at the document, then at me, then at his wife. And I could see it happening. That terrible, clarifying moment when a person begins to understand that 2 things they believed were true cannot both be true at the same time. That one of them has to give, Scarlett said. Derek. A warning. A reminder of whose side he was supposed to be on. He didn't look at her. Mom? He said slowly. Did he think that Scarlett was... Finish your dinner, Scarlett said sharply. We're not doing this here. I'm asking my mother a question. The shift in his voice was small, but I heard it, and I think she did too. I said, there's a letter, from your father. I'll give you a copy when you're ready to read it, but not tonight. Tonight I think you both just need to go home. I stood up, picked up my coat, left enough cash on the table for the water and the bread and a generous tip for Frank, who had kept a respectful distance all evening and deserved it. I buttoned my coat. Derek, I said, call me when you're ready. And I walked out onto Greenwich Avenue into the cold February night, and I didn't look back. The 4th attorney lasted 11 days. His withdrawal letter, copied to Naomi's office per the court's requirements, arrived on a Tuesday. Naomi called to tell me, and her voice had the careful neutrality of someone trying not to sound pleased. She has 30 days to retain new counsel before the trust filing becomes effectively uncontested, Naomi said. She won't find anyone, I said. No, Naomi agreed. She won't. She didn't. 30 days came. 30 days went. The trust became uncontested as a matter of record. Naomi filed the final documentation on a Thursday afternoon while I was in Bridgeport. I found out when I got back to my car at noon and saw her text. "It's done. Congratulations, Mrs. Voss. You own a company." I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes. A few people walked past. Someone had a dog, a small brown one that was very interested in a candy wrapper on the sidewalk. The February sun was doing its best, low and pale, producing light without much warmth. Richard, I thought. We own a company. Then I started the car and drove back to Stamford. 3 weeks later, the board met for the first time, with me formally presiding as trustee. I wore the same gray blazer from the tenant meeting. I sat at the head of the table Richard had sat at for 20 years, and I looked at 5 faces. Walter, steady and quietly satisfied. 2 longtime board members who had known Richard since the early days. A 4th who had been cautious about everything since the filing and was now visibly recalibrating. And Derek, at the far end, who had come alone. No, Scarlett. I kept the meeting to 45 minutes. We discussed the Lexington Avenue lease, 2 pending property assessments, and a development opportunity in White Plains that Richard had been evaluating before he died. The 4th board member, the cautious one, asked 3 careful questions and seemed relieved by the answers. Afterward, Walter walked me to the elevator. "Richard would have loved every second of this," he said. "He would have been insufferable about it," I said. Walter laughed. Genuinely, the first time I'd heard him do it since October. The elevator doors opened. And I stepped in. "Walter," I said, "get yourself a title upgrade. You've earned it." The doors closed on his expression. I smiled at my reflection in the polished steel. Derek came to Stamford on a Saturday in March. He knocked. I let him in. He stood in the doorway of my small apartment and looked at the folding table and the paintings on the wall and the slightly terrible fluorescent light, and didn't say anything for a moment. "This is where you've been living," he said finally. "It's fine," I said. "Sit down. I'll make coffee." He sat at the folding table. I made coffee. He looked at the watercolor I'd painted of the Lexington Avenue building, loose, imprecise, done in an afternoon from memory, and studied it the way he used to study things as a little boy, with his whole face. When I set the coffee down, he wrapped both hands around the mug, his father's gesture. He didn't know he did it. "I read Dad's letter," he said. I sat down across from him. "All of it?" 3 times. He looked up. "Did you know? Before he died? Did you have any idea what he'd done?" "No," I said honestly. "Not until Harrison gave me the envelope at the cemetery." "And you didn't say anything that night. You just said okay and went upstairs." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" I thought about it. The real answer, not the easy one. "Because I wasn't ready yet," I said. "And because I needed to understand what I had before I decided what to do with it. And because," I paused, "because I was very tired and I had just buried my husband and I didn't have the energy to fight anyone that night." Derek looked at his coffee. "Did Dad know that she'd—" "Yes," I said quietly. "He knew. For 3 years." The sound Derek made wasn't quite a word. It was something smaller and more broken than a word. I reached across the folding table and put my hand over his, and we stayed like that for a while without talking, the fluorescent light buzzing faintly above us, the Saturday morning traffic moving past the window outside. "What do I do?" he said finally. It was the voice of the boy who used to ask me things, before he learned to stop. "I can't tell you that," I said. "That part is yours." He nodded. He already knew. I think he'd known for longer than he wanted to admit. He cried then, properly, the way he hadn't let himself since October. I didn't tell him it was all right. It wasn't all right. Sometimes things aren't all right, and saying so doesn't help. I just kept my hand over his and let him. After a while, I made more coffee. We talked about his father, real things, old things, the fishing trips and the terrible jokes, and the way Richard mispronounced certain words his entire life and refused to be corrected. We laughed twice. It felt strange and necessary, like stretching a muscle that had been held tight for too long. He left at 2 o'clock. At the door he turned back. "Mom, the Greenwich house is yours," I said. "Your father left it to you. That's what he wanted. You could?" "Derek," I said it kindly. "I'm okay. I promise you I'm okay." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. Then he left. I stood at the window and watched him walk to his car, and I thought, there he is. There's my son. Scarlett and Derek separated in September. I found out from Ruth, who heard it through the particular information network, that small Connecticut communities maintain, regardless of anyone's preferences. The prenuptial agreement, drafted by Harrison Wells 8 years ago, at Richard's quiet insistence, before the wedding, significantly limited what Scarlett could claim. Harrison had thought of everything. Ruth called to tell me on a Sunday evening when I was painting. "Did you hear?" she said. I said. "That's all you have to say?" "Ruth," I said. "I'm in the middle of something." She laughed. We talked for an hour about other things. Her granddaughter's first steps. A book we'd both read. Whether the literacy program needed a new coordinator because the current one was moving to Portland. Normal things. The texture of a regular life. After we hung up, I sat for a moment with my brush in my hand. I thought about Scarlett, not with satisfaction, not with bitterness, with something more complicated than either, a kind of tired clarity. She had wanted something that was never hers, and she had spent 8 years and considerable intelligence pursuing it, and in the end, she had nothing to show for it except legal bills and a marriage that had been transactional from the beginning and had ended accordingly. I didn't wish her well exactly, but I didn't wish her anything else either. I went back to painting. Spring came the way it always does in Greenwich, suddenly, after you've stopped quite believing in it. One morning you wake up and the cold has loosened its grip overnight, and the light is different, and something in your chest recognizes it before your mind does. I was at the Lexington Avenue building for a trustee walkthrough with Walter, in early April, when he took me up to the 22nd floor, the top. He'd been vague about why. I followed him out of the elevator and through a door I hadn't been through before, and out onto a rooftop terrace. I stopped. Someone had been here. The terrace had been cleared, debris gone, surface cleaned, and along the south-facing edge, in long cedar planters that had no business being this beautiful in a commercial building, someone had planted things. Early spring things. Hellebores and ornamental grasses, and the first suggestions of what would become lavender in another month. Richard had plans for this space, Walter said quietly beside me. He kept pushing it back, never quite got to it. I stood at the railing. Manhattan spread out below, the grid of it, the water towers and glass towers, and the particular organized chaos of Midtown on an April morning. The sky above was the pale, clear blue that only exists for about 3 weeks in spring before it deepens into summer. "Who planted these?" I asked. Walter smiled. "The board approved a small landscaping budget last month. I may have taken some initiative." I looked at him. "Richard talked about it for 15 years. He said simply. Seemed like it was time." I turned back to the railing. The city below. The planters beside me. The lavender that wasn't quite lavender yet, but would be. I thought about Richard at his desk in the early mornings, carrying things quietly. I thought about a health scare he didn't tell me about, and 2 years of careful, loving preparation. I thought about an envelope pressed into my hand at a cemetery, and a name on a document I didn't recognize, and one long, terrible night on a stranger's bed, learning who I actually was. I thought about saying okay to a woman sitting in my husband's chair, and meaning something completely different by it than she understood. He used to say I was the one who made things stable enough for everything else to grow, I thought. I used to think that meant I was the background, the thing that held the frame together while everything else was the picture. The lavender moved slightly in the April wind. He meant it differently. The frame is the building. I just forgot, for a while, that I was also allowed to live inside it. I have a meeting at 2 o'clock. I am not late. If you've stayed with me through all 4 parts of this story, thank you. Truly. I want to ask you something before you go, and I want you to think about it honestly. Vivian said, okay, and walked away. And that silence became the most powerful thing she ever did. But for 3 months, she watched her son choose his wife's ambitions over his own mother, stood in her grief alone, and asked nothing of him. Here is what I keep thinking about. Was the silence wisdom, or was it also a kind of loss? And if Richard had simply told her the truth while he was alive, would any of this have been necessary at all? Leave your thoughts below. I read every one.